Hi everyone, welcome to the community classroom. This is History on Trial. This is Dr. Tracy McCarthy, psychologist, attorney, and educator. We're going to be addressing the topic of the text that is on the left side of the screen, which is White Cargo by Don Jordan and Michael Walsh. And this text is supposed to be about the forgotten history of Britain's white slaves in America. We're just going to quickly look at this revisionist narrative about slavery. And what's going on here is that groups of individuals, have collectively now determined that all of the individuals who were a part of all of the slave trades were in fact white versus black or light versus dark. This is an interesting revision here, and there are lots of implications for the revision. And so the first revision is that all of the individuals who were considered Jacobites, all of those individuals were light versus dark. All of the individuals who were a part of the Barbary Coast slave trade, all of those individuals were light versus dark. And all of the individuals involved in the transatlantic slave trade, all of those individuals were light versus dark, what you would tend to hear as white versus black. This is a very interesting narrative. There is really no proof to support what has been asserted. And it's been asserted over and over again. And what is happening is many individuals have a belief system, and they really don't seem to feel the need to present actual first-hand adequate evidence to support these contentions. It's just a contention that sounds good, feels good. There's a narrative that sort of supports it, and so therefore people are running with it. It's unclear whether this is based upon some self-esteem stuff and individuals are trying to recoup some sort of ancestral self-esteem, or if there is some other dynamic going on, such as just pure manipulation, which is what it looks like on the surface. Because again, there is really no solid evidence to support this assertion. Now, sometimes individuals will show paintings or pictures of what's considered white slavery. We're going to look at what white slavery is. And they'll show that over in the Middle East or over in North Africa. And that is supposed to be the true narrative for what took place in terms of the Jacobite transports, in terms of the Barbary Coast slave trade, and in terms of the transatlantic slave trade. Again, there is no hard, cold evidence to support this contention. And using the text White Cargo and similar text still do not serve the purpose of adequate evidence to completely revise history. And the other thing is that individuals are using the word European as a stand-in for the word white. And so whenever there is the assertion that there were Europeans who were enslaved, the other assertion that goes along with that is that the individuals were light, or what would be considered white. What's interesting about this is that these same individuals or collectives who are making this assertion, on one hand, on one day, they'll make that assertion, but on another day, the assertion will be that the Jacobites were actually black. And so it's unclear exactly why all of this flip-flopping is going on. But we're going to look at a number of dynamics very quickly, though, to test this assertion that is being made. Now, not only are these assertions being made, but people are not doing their homework. And so, therefore, they are led to believe a lie. They are not doing the work to challenge what is presented or even challenge their own thinking about things. And that's a problem. Anyway, between the 700s and the 1800s, you had lots of battles for succession. And a large amount of the slave trade revolved around these battles for succession. And some of these people involved in these battles for succession found themselves on slave ships or transport ships, bound for being bound. And so what we're going to do is we're going to look first at what white slavery is so that you get a better understanding of that, because what is taking place here is that this narrative that is on the left-hand side of the screen is being used to supplant or usurp the narrative that is on the right side of the screen. Now, clearly, there were a number of dynamics that were going on in terms of these slave trades that the dynamics are a little murky. However, there is more than sufficient evidence to support the contention that the transatlantic slave trade, for certain, was a slave trade involving darker people. There was even legislation in place to support this particular slavery scheme. There is not legislation in place that can be found to support this other contention about the white cargo. What you do have, though, is there is sufficient information to support that there was what you would consider European cargo. However, that European cargo was not unilaterally one phenotype. And we'll look a little bit more at that also. Pretty much whatever you look at in terms of definitions, when you look at white slavery, you're going to come up with pretty much the same thing over and over again. And it involves what would be considered sex slavery. And so the practice of trafficking lighter women in that type of enslavement, very specifically. And here you can see, if you do a search of it, you're going to come up with basically the same definition over and over and over again. It is not going to be this definition of enslaving Europeans for the slave trade in the plantations in the Americas or in the galleys or anything like that. And so this is the general definition of white slavery. And here you can see it again. And here you can see it again. And one of the things that this one actually mentions is the fact that this is not about race. So white slavery is not necessarily about race. It's more about sex slavery. But here you have a revision of reality based upon what we have in terms of the evidence. And you have here where those who are identified as British slaves on the Barbary Coast, simply because they are identified as British people, there is an extrapolation from that and an assertion that that automatically means white. So all of the European individuals who were transported, the assertion is that they were white. All of the European individuals who were enslaved, the assertion is that they were white. Now, what's odd about this is that you have a number of influencers on social media who happen to be brown or dark, and they seem to be the ones who are taking this narrative and running with it. And so the darker individuals are the ones, for the most part, who are really undergirding this assertion that basically that the Jacobites were all white, that the enslaved people from Africa were all white, that all of the enslaved people up in North Africa, the Barbary Coast slave trade, they were also all white. So there has to be a reason for this pushing of the narrative, and I'll let you figure that out. You do your homework and you figure that out. And this is just additional discussion about the Barbary Coast slave trade. And what's really interesting about this is not just the conversation, but the names in here. And when you look up at the top, you see a name that, while it's a European name, it looks very much like the names that have been attributed to those who would be considered American Indian. But we're not going to go into that right now. This is not to suggest that this person was an American Indian. It's in part to suggest that some of these names that have been attributed to American Indians have actually come from elsewhere. Now, let's look at some of these slave ship manifests. Now, your task is going to be to determine the extent to which you believe this narrative, this revisionist narrative, is accurate. And of course, the narrative is that the individuals were transported from Liverpool, in this instance, to the plantations in the Americas. They were always going to the plantations in the Americas. The Jacobites were going to the plantations in the Americas and the Caribbean. What's interesting, however, is that you don't seem to see these transported people in Jamaica or the Caribbean. You pretty much see dark people. So this white cargo narrative does not comport with the reality in terms of the populations that were in the Caribbean or the populations that were in the Americas with respect to these transports. Now again, you look over to the left and you see the Liverpool and you see the vessel name Society, which is interesting in and of itself. And then you see over to the right hand side the Battle of Succession time period. And so you have to ask yourself, do you really believe that these slave ship vessels, one named Society, starting in Liverpool, going to Wida, also known as Judah, so picking up people at Judah, transporting them to the Americas, during this time period of the battles for succession, are you believing that all of these individuals were lighter individuals and they were enslaved on the plantations in the Americas, and that there were no darker people or very few darker people involved in this particular enslavement process, coming from Liverpool, going to Judah or Wida, into the Americas? Give that some thought. And here we have some more Society ships. One thing you might want to think about with respect to Society and this name for a slave ship is, what is this talking about? What type of society are we talking about? Okay, so you have some more ships coming out of Bristol, London, Liverpool. These are the same places the ships were coming out for the Jacobites. They're going into the Gold Coast, going into ports that they don't want to specify, and again going into Wida, Judah, and ending up in Barbados, Annapolis, Kingston, Jamaica, Virginia. Now, I pulled out this one because, of course, this would be one that someone would attempt to pull out to support this belief that the enslaved people were lighter. So this is from the Isle of Wight. If you do some research on the Isle of Wight, however, you will find that the demographic that is asserted about the Isle of Wight is inconsistent with the historical demographic for the Isle of Wight. At any rate, the Isle of Wight, name of this vessel, left Portsmouth, went into Africa, and landed in Barbados, again during the battles of succession. And here we have the slave ship, the Liverpool. Same dynamic here, leaving out of Liverpool, going into Africa, landing in the Americas, in places in the Caribbean where you would normally have a darker population of people. But according to the revisionist narrative, all of these individuals were lighter. And additional Liverpool ships going into the Bight of Benin, Bight of Biafra, and then ending up in the Potomac and in the Caribbean. And here we have more Liverpool ships. This gets a bit more interesting because here you have vessels named Egyptian, again coming out of Liverpool and La Rochelle, going into Africa, and then ending up in the Caribbean. And then, of course, we have Cromwell. And so here you have a slave ship going by the name Cromwell, starting off in St. Croix, going through Africa, and then no other information, but again, during that Battle of Succession time period. Now, why there would be a slave ship named Cromwell is unclear, because of course Cromwell was involved with the Jacobite deportations. And so we've already talked about this before, where the slave ships and the Jacobite deportation ships were the same ships basically. And sometimes they would go through Africa. They would start off as a transportation deportation ship, go through Africa, and by the time they landed in the United States or in the Americas, they had been transformed into a slave ship. And those individuals and groups who are talking about these revisions, they are fully aware of that. So again, it's unclear what the purpose is for asserting these revisions about who was actually enslaved. And here we have slave vessels named Ethiopian. So we've got Egyptian, we've got Ethiopian, and they are going into the Congo area, and you see they're landing in New Orleans. You have some of these ships coming very early, 1662, and then that later one in 1807. I will tell you this notation. There is no notation for slave ships with the name Edom or Esau or Ishmael, but what you do have is Abraham and Isaac. You have Abraham and Moses. So in this instance, you have these Abraham and Isaac ships coming out of London, going to the Gold Coast, and ending up in the Caribbean, and then also ending up in Portugal. And continuing on with these slave ships that are named in relation to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, you have King Solomon. So you have several of these King Solomon ships coming out of London. You see principal place of slave purchase, Ouidah in Judah. So you see a number of destinations off to the right. Again, this is during that Battle of Succession time period, but you see the destinations, the principal place of slave landing being in the Caribbean. Again, there is no evidence to support the contention that all of these people, or even the overwhelming majority of these people, were lighter people. Now, there was a search done for the word white and then the word black, and there was an overwhelming number of ships with the name black attached to them, and an underwhelming number of ships with the name white attached to them. And you can look at that for yourself so that you have that information for yourself. But here you have a list of the Black Prince over and over and over again with the Black Prince in terms of the name of the slave ship. Coming out of Newport, London, Bristol, Rhode Island, going through Africa, again ending up in the Caribbean. And again, not only do you have a listing of ships with Black Prince, but you also have Blackmore ships. And those ships are all coming out of Bristol. Again, these are the same places that the Jacobite deportation ships came out of. Then you have all of these places in Africa in terms of the slave acquisition of enslaved people, and then ending up from Jamaica to Barbados, the York River, ending up in the Americas, again during that time of the battles of succession. And the list goes on with the name Black in terms of the slave ship, from the Black Prince to Black Joke. You might want to do some research on that right there. You see going into Africa and then ending up in the Americas and the Caribbean. And here you have a couple of ships named Romulus, and this is just another name for Rome. And as we begin to wrap this up, some new slave ship names were noted. They are very interesting. The first two pretty early on in the 1600s, and the vessel names were the China Merchant. They were coming out of London, and they purchased enslaved people at Judah, also known as Ouida, and those individuals were delivered to Barbados and Jamaica. And there is an additional ship with another odd name, Jerusalem. That one is going into Havana. Now it is your job to do your homework and study and find out what you understand the truth to be. It is insufficient to simply listen to people who are influencers on social media tell you what the truth is. You have the access to the same resources that they do. Look at those resources and make a determination for yourself about what the facts are and what the likely truth is growing out of those facts. We are in a time period where there is a significant amount of deception going on, a significant amount of historical revision going on, and a great deal of people not paying attention to what is going on. And so it is incumbent upon you to start to pay a little bit better attention to what is going on and not just accept things as they are presented without question, without double checking. Remember, knowledge is power. Take care and see you soon.